and welcome to the first module in our second anti-racism series. Module 1, Standing Up Against Islamophobia, explores Muslim lived experiences in Canada, the dimensions and complexities of Islamophobia, and how we can understand and work against Islamophobia as anti-racist educators within French as a second language teaching context. We are your hosts for Module 1. My name is Kulsum Anwar, and I'm a secondary educator and curriculum leader of English with the Toronto District School Board. I am deeply committed to anti-racist and anti-oppression education. I am a Muslim and the child of Pakistani immigrants, and these identities have always mattered a lot to the incredibly diverse students I teach.
And I'm Yasmin Abdelan, and I'm a science secondary educator at an independent school in Ontario. I'm an Egyptian Canadian who immigrated to Canada in 2012. As a female Muslim, my identity significantly influences how students engage with me both inside and outside the classroom. In academic settings, there's often a mix of curiosity and respect regarding my beliefs and practices. Outside the classroom, my identity can sometimes lead to stereotypes or assumptions, but it also opens opportunities for meaningful discussions about diversity and inclusivity. Overall, being a female Muslim shapes a dynamic interaction where mutual respect plays pivotal roles in shaping my experiences.
Throughout the module, we suggest that you keep a notebook or a Google document nearby to write down your thoughts and reflections. Before we start, we invite you to pause and reflect on the following questions. What do you find exciting and/or challenging about equity, diversity, and inclusion in FSL education? What is your approach to Islamophobia education? Have you been invited to think about Islamophobia in FSL teaching as an anti-racist practitioner? If so, how? What silences do you notice or feel uncomfortable with in the field when it comes to the topic of Islamophobia? We will return to these questions at the end of the module. Muslims are a growing community in Canada. Almost 5% of Canadians are Muslim, and it's the second largest faith group. In Ontario, the number is higher, with 6.7% of residents identifying as Muslim. Let's take a brief look at the history of Muslims in Canada. It's longer than we might think. Hassam Munir's Canadian Islamic History Month timeline offers us a good overview. Officially, Muslims have been in Canada for almost 170 years, with the first Muslims being Black Muslims, Richard Pierpoint, Mahoma Bakokwa, and Nicholas Said. Official records name James and Agnes Love, a couple from Scotland who converted to Islam there and then immigrated to Ontario in 1854. As immigration policies in Canada became less discriminatory, this contributed to growth in the Muslim population. By the mid-1980s, there were 100,000 Muslims in Canada and more than 500,000 in the year 2000. Over the years, Muslim Canadians have made diverse contributions to the fabric of Canadian life, whether in political office, Olympic sport, or on television. This Historica Canada video tells the story of Canada's first mosque, the Al Rashid Mosque, which was opened in 1938. Muslim women in Edmonton were behind this historic step for the Canadian Muslim community. Hilwi Hamdan, a Lebanese immigrant who was the president of the local Muslim Ladies Society, worked with Mayor John Fry to acquire land, and then she and her team fundraised for the mosque's construction, working with Edmonton residents and the Jewish and Christian communities. In 1982, Edmonton's Muslim community moved to a bigger mosque, and the Al Rashid Mosque was boarded up for 6 years, then slated for demolition to make way for a hospital parking lot. The Edmonton chapter of the Canadian Council for Muslim Women raised $100,000 in 8 months to get the mosque deemed a historic building and move it to Fort Edmonton Park, a living history museum for historic buildings, despite considerable negative sentiment against Muslims related to the First Gulf War. The story of the Al Rashid Mosque lives on in the story of the Canadian prayer rug. A Métis designer working with a local Muslim weaver created this rug, infused with symbols representing Alberta and its landscape, using wool hand-dyed with colors from local native plants. The rug is a beautiful expression of community, collaboration, creativity, and shared history. Prayer rugs are traditionally designed to reflect the place they come from. This particular one reflects the Canadian landscape that Albertan Muslims call home. In 2017, the Toronto District School Board's Islamic Heritage Month Committee put together a resource guidebook for educators that has since become widely used beyond their board and across the province. In addition to offering lessons and activities tied to the history and culture of Muslim peoples, it offers curated lists of books, films, speakers, artists, and hands-on resources like daily announcements for Islamic Heritage Month. This resource features an educator's primer on Islam that provides important contextual knowledge for any teacher supporting Muslim students. Allah is the term used universally by Muslims to mean God. The term Islam comes from an Arabic root that generates words with interrelated meanings, including submission, commitment, and peace. Essentially, Islam refers to choosing to submit and commit to a life in accordance with the will of God. Pronunciation matters, and it is important to note that the S in both Islam and Muslim sound like S's and not Zs. The pronunciations Islam and Muslim are incorrect. The correct pronunciation is Islam and Muslim. I've linked here an easy reference to this pronunciation. The terms Mohammedanism or Mohammedan are antiquated misnomers that should not be used in place of the terms Islam or Muslim, respectively, as these suggest Muslims worship their prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, rather than God. The term and spelling Muslim is also outdated and inappropriate. In French, the gender terms musulman and musulmane are used to denote Muslim. The 5 pillars of Islam encompass what Muslims do as part of their faith. The first pillar is the Shahada, a statement of faith. Salah refers to the 5 daily ritual prayers scheduled throughout the day. The Zohar prayer often coincides with the school day, so you may be familiar with this one, as students take time out of the day to perform it. Zakat is prescribed annual charitable giving. Psalm is the fasting incumbent on Muslims during the month of Ramadan. Finally, Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca to see the Kaaba, if one is physically and financially able. The Kaaba, which literally means cube, is believed by Muslims to be the original house of worship on earth. When Muslims perform their daily prayers, they orient themselves in the direction of the Kaaba. What Muslim women wear has become a site of questions, confusion, and oppression. Modesty is an important concept in Muslim praxis. Modesty extends beyond clothing to also impact use of language, physicality, and gender interactions. Some Muslims may refrain from physical contact between genders, including handshaking. We see great diversity of practices related to modesty in many faith communities, including within and among Muslims, but modesty is a concept often tied to religion. One aspect of modesty is the wearing of hijab by adult women to cover their hair, ears, and neck. Some children may wear it as well to prepare them for future practice and or in harmony with their mothers. A small minority of Muslim women choose to wear the niqab, which is a face covering or veil worn in addition to the hijab. Some women in diverse faith communities, Christian, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, and Rastafarian, choose to cover their hair, but Muslim women who do so are often confronted with gendered Islamophobia, which assumes that women in hijab are oppressed, even when those women are saying something different. We will learn more about gendered Islamophobia later in this module. The children's book Hats of Faith by Medea Cohen Petrolino is a great way to start a conversation about faith-based practices. Some Muslim women choose not to wear the hijab in the same way that others choose to wear it. Both hijabi and non-hijabi Muslim women, however, share a lived experience where their wearing or not wearing of the hijab is viewed as the business of others. Non-Muslim women are likely to relate to this lived experience since so many have faced interference with what they choose to wear or not wear at work, at school, in their homes, and on the street. Parental influence can work to encourage their daughters to wear hijab or discourage them. In the popular Marvel comic Miss Marvel, which features a Muslim protagonist, Kamala Khan's father disapproves of her choice to wear the hijab. I know other Muslim women whose families discourage their wearing of the hijab because of fear of discrimination. As educators, we work with young people in the process of forming their identities and trying out different choices. Some girls may wear the hijab for a while and then stop. They may choose to wear it at different times. By definition, these choices are their own. There are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, and most of them are not Arab. Being Arab is often conflated with Muslim identity, but Arabs follow various faiths. About 50 countries in the world have 50% or more of their population
identifying as Muslim. The Muslim-majority countries are found all over the world, as seen in this graph. It may surprise some to learn that the country with the highest number of Muslims is Indonesia. It's no surprise that there's a lot of diversity among Muslims in Canada as well. There are 67 million people in France, but there are 321 million francophones in the world, according to Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. The OIF has 54 full members, and a number of these are Muslim-majority nations or have significant Muslim populations. In many countries previously colonized by France, there are French-speaking Muslims, notably in North and West Africa, but also Lebanon and Syria. This has also shaped Francophone immigration to Canada, with French-speaking Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, and Lebanese immigrants represented in the highest numbers. The 2011 StatsCan Canadian National Household Survey found that French was the second most common language spoken by Canadian Muslims, but the other languages on this list also reflect the diverse identities of Muslims in Canada. In the 2021 census, 1.5 million Canadians identified as Black. Of those, 11.9% reported that they were Muslim. In her chapter, Black and Muslim, in Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada, Jillery Massa explores the intersections of a Black Muslim identity, which finds many Black Muslims dealing not only with anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, but also discrimination from other non-Black Muslims. She also notes, quote, equal frustration with the non-Muslim Black community members who may struggle with their understandings of Islam and of a Black identity intertwined with a Muslim one.
For the second part of the presentation, we're going to define Islamophobia. We're going to talk about its prevalence in Canada and how it impacts the lives of Muslim Canadians on a day-to-day basis. Before we define Islamophobia, we first need to ask ourselves some questions about our understanding of what Islamophobia is. To be able to do this, we need to reflect on our identities and upbringings, personal experiences, assumptions, implicit biases, and privileges, which will in turn shape how we have come to know about Islamophobia. The first question that you want to ask yourself is, as a Canadian, how can you define Islamophobia? Do you think that Islamophobia exists in your local communities? In what ways do you believe Islamophobia is prominent? This might be based on your family members' experiences of students in your schools, experiences of colleagues in your workplaces, news reports or social media accounts of Canadian Muslim experiences, or it might even be your own personal experiences with Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hate or discrimination based on the Islamic faith. Regardless of how you have come to know about Islamophobia and what it is, the next question is, how can you, as a Canadian citizen and an educator, stand up to various forms of Islamophobia? This accounts for explicit and implicit forms of Islamophobia. What is Islamophobia? According to Canada's anti-racism strategy, documented in 2019-2022, Islamophobia includes racism, stereotypes, prejudice, fear, or acts of hostility directed towards Muslims. In addition to individual acts of intolerance and racial profiling, Islamophobia can unfairly lead to viewing and treating Muslims as a greater security threat on an institutional, systemic, and societal level. The term Islamophobia dates from the 1990s. The British Runnymede Report of 1997, titled Islamophobia: A Challenge for Us All, defined Islamophobia as the dread, hatred, hostility towards Islam and Muslims perpetrated by a series of closed views that imply and attribute negative and degradatory stereotypes and beliefs to Muslims. The term was then used again after 9/11 in a 2002 report published by the European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia and Racism, documenting incidents of violence and discrimination against Muslims in Europe. The word has come to refer to both anti-Muslim sentiments, referring to the group of people who practice the religion of Islam, and anti-Islam sentiments, referring to the religion itself, or even people who have been perceived to be Muslims based on physical appearances. These anti-Muslim sentiments may also overlap with racism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant views as well. Interestingly, the suffix phobia in the word Islamophobia is not attached to other forms of discrimination for religious groups, and it primarily stems from pre existing ways in which Muslims have been perceived as different from the larger Western society. It should be recognized that not all Muslims experience Islamophobia in the same ways. For Muslim women, Islamophobia is experienced not only with regard to religion, but also about gender. With this lens in mind, we can examine internalized, interpersonal, and structural interactions that Muslim women who wear the hijab face as forms of gendered Islamophobia. Islamophobia is gendered, which means it operates based on gendered stereotypes about Muslim men who are often perceived as violent terrorists and patriarchs, and Muslim women who are often perceived as subjugated victims who are oppressed and silenced. These stereotypes come from the usually Christian majority culture that condemn and simplify perceptions in an us against them mentality, which dates back to the Crusades in the Middle Ages and the taking back of Jerusalem from the Muslim majority at the time. Media representations of Muslim men and women play a huge role in this. Common representations of Muslim women depict them as inherently oppressed by men. When Muslim women in Western countries choose to wear a form of religious covering, they're often harassed, which restricts their freedom of choice, even though religious coverings are not unique to Islam. For example, some women who practice other religions, such as Christianity and Judaism, also wear head coverings. This depiction also completely opposes Islam's emphasis on women's rights, which was so central to the Prophet's teachings, peace be upon him. As he reiterated in his famous farewell speech, "My parting counsel to you is to treat women with kindness." And throughout his life, he emphasized, "The best of you are those who are best to your women." He even stood up against social injustices and criticized the custom of gender bias. Resisting gendered Islamophobia means that recognizing Muslim women are not passive victims that need to be saved, but rather that Islam dignifies and protects the rights of women. For many Muslim women, Islam is a resource for liberation. Resisting gendered Islamophobia is about listening to the voices of Muslim women to understand the forms of solidarity that they need. Reclaiming Public Space is an online platform that showcases a photo shoot taken by a photographer named Faiza Omer, who gathered 6 Black Muslim women and girls in a South Edmonton studio who got to talk about the fear and joy of being Black Muslim women in public places. All of the subjects are first or second generation Somali Canadians who share their experiences as Black Muslim Canadians. In 2021, a year before this photo shoot was taken, there were a series of hate crimes that happened in seemingly mundane public places. 6 attacks in as many months, most of them on Somali and hijabi women. Some of the women sitting for portraits knew victims of the attacks. The community and the government have launched some initiatives since the attack, including self-defense classes for Muslim women and a new court support program for Black women. But as one of the women mentioned, putting the onus of safety on the women themselves normalizes the violence against them. The women expressed their constant fear of being in public places after the series of hate crimes. One of the women said, "I don't want to fight someone just to go to the grocery store," she said. "It's almost as if you're putting their right to harm me over my right to even exist." She elaborates on how the uptick in violence can be directly linked to white supremacist rhetoric spewed or complacently ignored by politicians. I therefore invite you to refer to the first module on the OMLTA website titled "The Roots of White Supremacy," which explores the history of race and racism in North America and how white supremacist thinking continues to be sustained in teaching and learning. Let me introduce you to a website and a video series called Islamophobia Is, which situates anti-Muslim hate crimes within the broader context of normalized Islamophobia, one that is sustained by dominant misconceptions about Islam and Muslims and is advanced by mainstream media. Using short, engaging, and linguistically accessible animated videos, This series brings academic knowledge and analysis on normalized Islamophobia to mainstream audiences. Its content is appropriate for students, grades 6 upwards, and adult audiences. It is also accessible for Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Incidences like the Quebec mosque shooting are enabled by a whole deeper level of policies and practices that enables Islamophobia to persist in our society. To really understand and address Islamophobia, we need to look beyond incidences of mass violence and to address what lies beneath the surface. I invite you to explore a short video on the same website titled Islamophobia is Perpetuated by Mainstream Media, which shows how our mainstream media doesn't just deliver us facts, it also strongly influences how we feel about the facts. In this case, by suggesting that Muslim lives aren't as important as non-Muslim ones. While Canada is known to be a diverse society and its multiculturalism is often celebrated and viewed as a strength, statistics on the public perceptions of Muslims in Canada have shown otherwise. Almost half of the Canadian population has an unfavorable view of Islam, and half of them hold discriminatory views and misconceptions about Muslims and Islam. 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam, which is more than for any other religious tradition. 56% of Canadians believe that Islam suppresses women's rights. More than half of people living in Ontario feel mainstream Muslim doctrines promote violence. 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little or not at all. 42% of Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. On a side note, it is also really important to know that Ontario and Quebec have the largest Muslim populations in Canada, and Montreal, in particular, has a thriving Muslim population that has felt these effects more recently. 47% of Canadians support banning of headscarves, which are the hijab, in public, compared with 30% of Americans. 51% of Canadians support government surveillance of mosques, as compared to 46% of Americans. 55% of Canadians think the problem of Islamophobia is overblown by politicians and media, and only 29% supported a motion to condemn and study Islamophobia. These public perceptions of Islam and Muslims are problematic because they further perpetuate anti-Muslim hate, which disproportionately harms Muslim Canadians. This is a study that was conducted in the United States, but the same experiences are mirrored in Canada by Muslims. Participants in this study self-identified as Muslim and represented various ethnic groups. The study revealed that Muslims experience Islamophobia in a variety of ways and in various contexts. Participants reported that they experienced anti-Muslim discrimination in schools, workplaces, homes, stores, and airports. Muslim travelers have reported experiencing racial profiling at airports and border crossings, including being stopped, being followed by air marshals, being placed on no-fly lists, having their names flagged, being selected for random screening, being subjected to intrusive body and or luggage searches, and being questioned about their religious beliefs. The National Council of Canadian Muslims notes that 15% of the human rights complaints it received in 2014 were from Muslims who were turned away from border crossings without any explanations. When asked if they have ever directly experienced Islamophobia, most participants said that they had encountered some form of anti-Muslim discrimination. These incidents included a range of discriminatory acts, including verbal and physical harassment, profiling by law enforcement agencies, road rage acts, and physical assaults. Participants discussed physical assaults in public locations, vandalism at their homes, persistent questioning regarding their country of origin, and verbal harassment in the form of derogatory terms. As a result of these experiences, Muslims in Canada often respond in a few ways. Some by deciding to conceal their Muslim identity, for example, changing their names or way of dressing to get jobs or to be accepted in public places. Second, by becoming more aware or vocal about their identities as a Muslim, for example, by participating in ways to raise awareness about Islamophobia or joining a political campaign to change policies that address and combat Islamophobia. Third, by withdrawing from mainstream society in fear of being treated differently. Fourth, by being extra vigilant in public places to avoid possible anti-Muslim hate-motivated attacks. 5. Through loss of faith in prevailing establishments, institutions, and political systems. For example, Muslim women in Quebec having to quit their jobs due to banning of the hijab, or Muslim students leaving certain schools due to experiences of discrimination and racist Islamophobic comments from their teachers, administrators, and peers. And lastly, mental health impacts that can result in loss of self-worth, demoralization, and in many instances, these experiences can even lead to chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. Following the Quebec mosque shooting in 2017, the public reaction to the government motion, M103, and the religious accommodation and prayer debate at the public boards like Peel District School Board, there was a need for student voice to allow Muslim students to talk about their experiences at schools. Some of these findings I've shared earlier reflect the voices of high school students in various schools in Ontario. Islamophobia is experienced by all Canadians, regardless of their socioeconomic status or their background. Canada's first Muslim senator, Mubina Jaffer, recounted being strip-searched after September 11, 2001 attacks. She said, "The weeks following 9/11 were incredibly difficult for Muslim Canadians." She recounts that when she and her husband got on the aeroplane to Vancouver from her swearing ceremony, they were subjected to intense inspection followed every time she flew. She then further describes this intense inspection by saying, "My husband and I were called outside and we were both asked to completely undress. I'm a senator. If that happens to me, what do you think life is like for ordinary Muslims?" This keeps us thinking about how Islamophobia has been normalized and embedded in every aspect of Western society.
In the past few years, there have been concerted efforts to combat Islamophobia using different approaches. Parliament proclaimed October Islamic History Month in 2007 to honor Muslim contributions to Canadian society. While efforts such as these don't necessarily make explicit connections to standing up to Islamophobia, the project of cultural sharing underpins a larger project of humanization that becomes requisite for marginalized peoples living in a discriminatory society. Many school boards acknowledge a variety of heritage months to celebrate, reflect, and learn about our diversity. But for those groups that experience identity-based discrimination, these efforts are more than that. For example, in the Toronto District School Board, there is an author talk that takes place in January for elementary school students, organized by the Islamic Heritage Month Committee. But it also takes place on the National Day of Action Against Islamophobia and remembrance of the Quebec mosque attack. This kind of work is extremely important, especially when one considers that the young man who murdered 4 members of a Muslim family in London, Ontario in 2021 was only 19 years old, a recent graduate of the Ontario school system. It is startling to consider that more Muslims have been killed in targeted hate attacks in Canada than in any other G7 country in the past few years. And this timeline doesn't take into account the innumerable micro and overt aggressions that visibly Muslim women and men experience on a daily basis. In 2023, Amira El-Gawabi was appointed Canada's Special Representative on Combating Islamophobia. In light of the timeline on the previous slide, we can all understand why. But her experiences within this position have served to highlight how challenging this mandate is in Canada. In 2019, well before El-Gawabi was appointed Special Representative, Quebec passed Bill 21, legislation that would prevent public sector workers like teachers, lawyers, and police from wearing religious clothing or symbols, ostensibly to support secularism. In July 2019,
El-Gawabi, alongside Bernie Farber, published this article in the Ottawa Citizen, critiquing the bill and arguing that it was motivated by Islamophobia. Both El-Gawabi and Farber were part of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network at this time. They quote a Montreal Gazette interview with Jack Jedwab, president of the Association for Canadian Studies, who said that Bill 21 is, quote, mainly driven by the hijabs and the other religious symbols are collateral damage, end quote. El-Gawabi and Farber also cite a Ledger marketing poll that found that 88% of Quebecers who had negative views of Islam supported Bill 21. In their column, El-Gawabi and Farber also call out Quebec Premier François Legault for dismissing concerns around the safety of Muslim women. This CBC article reports that Legault told CBC Radio that he does not believe Muslim women in Quebec who reported facing heightened Islamophobia post-Bill 21. In about 2 months' time since Bill 21 was tabled in March 2019, the women's advocacy group Justice Femmes recorded over 40 Islamophobic incidents around Montreal. Legault described the law as moderate and alluded to similar laws enacted in European countries, asking if Quebec is being called racist, whether that meant France, Belgium, and Germany were racist as well. 4 years later, Quebec politicians criticized El-Gawabi's appointment as special representative because of the Ottawa Citizen article. She tried to explain the context for her comments, but ultimately was forced to apologize in a deeply ironic act. Canada's special representative on combating Islamophobia was pilloried for calling out Islamophobia by the very people enacting institutional Islamophobia. Her apology did not circumvent continued outcry from Quebec politicians who questioned her credibility, legitimacy, and demanded her resignation. In December 2021, Fatma Anvari lost her job teaching grade 3 at Chelsea Elementary School in Quebec because of Bill 21's ban on her hijab and other religious symbols. Anvari originates from Iran, a country which requires women to wear the hijab. Considering the hijab law in Iran and that in Quebec, she told City News, quote, I think in essence there is no difference because it all comes down to policing women and their choices. And I see both as equally wrong, both as defying, I guess, basic human rights. And I think that both need to be very seriously confronted, end quote. The National Council of Canadian Muslims, NCCM, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, CCLA, filed a lawsuit as soon as Bill 21 became law in 2019. The UN wrote a letter of concern regarding Bill 21 because of its infringement on the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief. Provincial and municipal governments across Canada have spoken out about this law, passed motions, and pledged funds for the lawsuit. Brampton has led these efforts. Currently, NCCM and the CCLA are trying to get the Supreme Court of Canada to hear an appeal to their constitutional challenge to Bill 21. The NCCM has expressed disappointment about the lack of action against this bill from federal leaders. For 20 years, France has enacted laws that infringe on Muslim identity and the religious freedom of Muslim women. The Bridge Initiative, a think tank at Georgetown University, has laid out this history in the timeline pictured, which highlights several significant dates, including the initial 2004 ban on religious symbols like hijab in state schools, a 2007 ban on hijab in public service jobs, a 2010 ban on niqab, the face covering, in all public places, everywhere from parks to the streets. In 2016, some municipalities banned modest swimwear like the burkini, though this was suspended by the Council of State, the French Supreme Court for Administrative Justice, until 2023, when the Council of State upheld a Grenoble City Council decision to ban the burkini. That same year, Council of State upheld the French Football Federation's 2016 ban on hijab. The pace of such bans increased in 2023 with a ban on abayas in public school. An abaya is a long, loose, robe-like garment preferred by many Muslim women. In 2023, France also banned the hijab for any French athletes competing in the 2024 Paris Olympics. What Muslim women wear has long been an issue for France, including during its colonial rule of Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa. During this era, hijab was often viewed as a symbol of possible resistance to colonial control of the people. Mubashra Tazamal, writing for the Bridge Initiative, cites public ceremonies where Muslim women were unveiled, either by choice or under French colonial pressure, and the clothing thrown or burned. These ceremonies were characterized as liberation of Muslim women, and we can see the echoes of these colonial ideas today in these laws, although secularism is the stated aim. This June, the NCCM released a report on the impact of Bill 21 on the employment conditions of Quebecois Muslim women. They questioned justifications that suggest that the banning of religious symbols is a way to create social cohesion and well-being. The survey of 411 women funded by the federal government Department Women and Gender Equality Canada shows that Muslim women feel beleaguered in a Bill 21 Quebec. 1 in 5 experienced physical attacks at work, while 54% witnessed or experienced offensive comments from those they work with. Many felt that Bill 21 emboldened people to express racist or prejudiced views about their religious identity. The COVID-19 pandemic actually helped by offering Muslim women a break from their tense, in-person working environments. More than 70% of the women surveyed are actively trying to leave the province. Most of these women are francophones. Others are trying to find work in Muslim communities. Isolation and emigration are emerging impacts of Bill 21 in Quebec. The Green Square campaign is the NCCM initiative that takes place during the week leading up to January 29th, the National Day of Remembrance of the Quebec City mosque attack and action against Islamophobia. The Green Square symbolizes the green carpets of the Centre Culturel Islamique de Québec. It was upon those green carpets that the victims were praying just before Alexandra Bissonnette attacked worshippers on January 29, 2017. Islamic views of the afterlife characterize heaven as a green garden, and this square also alludes to the prayer that the victims are in that better place. Many schools participate in this campaign with felt or paper squares. 6 Muslim men were murdered in this attack and 5 injured. Azadine Sufyan, 57, a grocery store owner, fought the shooter and was awarded the Star of Courage posthumously. Prior to the shooting, the same mosque had been the target of several acts of intolerance and intimidation. In response, the mosque had installed security cameras. The shooter, Bissonnette, was known as a supporter of Marine Le Pen, who leads France's far-right xenophobic National Front Party. All 6 men were immigrants from countries in the Francophonie. 2 were Guineans, 2 Algerians, 1 Moroccan, and 1 Tunisian. At the city level, other campaigns are underway. This one is from Toronto and was created with NCCM and in consultation with a number of Muslim organizations. Federal efforts to combat Islamophobia include a 2023 Senate report, which made 13 recommendations to address the rise of Islamophobia, including new educational campaigns and resources, new criminal code offenses for hate-motivated crimes, and enhanced data collection by the Canada Revenue Agency's Charities Directorate, which disproportionately scrutinizes Muslim charities. The official response to the report says, quote, "The government acknowledges with gratitude the care and attention that the committee members have given to the set of diverse and complex issues of Islamophobia brought forward by the study's witnesses. Muslims and their communities have been targeted in violent attacks across the country, and they have been facing hate for decades through negative stereotyping in popular culture, the media, in political discourse, and in everyday life, especially after the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States of America and the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel and the ensuing Israel-Hamas conflict. The report notes that Islamophobia intersects with other forms of oppression to create compounding barriers for individuals and communities, including sexism and gender-based violence, anti-refugee, anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Black or anti-Asian racism, and poverty." End quote. However, the government did not support Recommendation 11 that calls for civilian oversight of the Canadian Revenue Agency, despite evidence that the CRA disproportionately targeted Muslim charities for audits because of Islamophobic perceptions of Islamic charities as potentially criminal or terrorist. As noted in the government's response to the Senate report, there is no doubt that what goes on globally impacts Canadian Muslims. Since the events of October 7, 2023, the number of Islamophobic hate crimes has increased significantly. David Hoffman, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of New Brunswick, says, "Crimes in response to incidents such as war are known as reactive hate crimes. So, as opposed to hate crimes from long-established groups, reactive crimes are tied to basically world events as people get caught up in identitarian issues, nationalistic issues." Reactive hate crimes are when members of a group are blamed for actions perpetrated by someone who shares some aspect of their identity, such as those that occurred post 9/11. The situation in historic Palestine and Israel is political, but is often characterized as religious. Palestinians are mostly Muslim, but have other religious affiliations as well. Anti-Palestinian racism, or APR, names a systemic human rights issue. Let's go through the definition. Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms, including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging, and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians, and their allies. Defaming Palestinians and their allies with slander, such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist threat or sympathizer, or opposed to democratic values. The Canadian Human Rights Commission highlighted anti-Palestinian racism in its 2023 report to Parliament, calling for collective action to address this human rights issue. The Government of Canada also acknowledged rising APR in Changing Systems, Transforming Lives, Canada's Anti-Racism Strategy 2024 to 2028. The Toronto District School Board passed a motion in June 2024 to include anti-Palestinian racism in its Combating Hate and Racism student learning strategy. Error in thinking that has people viewing the Palestine-Israel conflict as religious leads to greater levels of Islamophobia. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association highlights the point that this conflation means that Muslims are being targeted because of APR and Palestinians can be targeted because of Islamophobia. It notes, Muslims may experience APR over their perceived support for Palestine. Palestinians may experience Islamophobia irrespective of their religion. While there may be intersections between the two, APR and Islamophobia are distinct conceptual categories. Failure to differentiate them raises problems of over-inclusiveness and under-inclusiveness, perpetuates stereotypes of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, and denies Palestinians redress. The Islamophobia-motivated incident reporting tool, IMRIT, an app, was launched in January 2024 to address the underreporting of Islamophobia. Official statistics are simply not capturing the real numbers of Islamophobic incidents for multiple reasons. Barbara Perry, director of the Centre on Hate, Bias and Extremism at Ontario Tech University, notes that because Muslims are both over and under-policed, distrust of law enforcement contributes to underreporting. Indeed, the Senate Committee on Human Rights Recommendation 3, from its report discussed earlier in this module, called for the creation of a federal hate-motivated crimes reporting hotline to ensure data better reflect Muslims' lived experiences of Islamophobia. The report references attacks on Black Muslim women in Edmonton and quotes Dunya Noor of the African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, who pointed out the added challenges Black Muslim women faced when incidents were reported to the police, noting that ultimately they received no response or support. Rizwana Karudina of Muslim Educators Network of Ontario says, quote, Muslim students have shared that it is normal to be called a terrorist and that they consistently encounter Islamophobia, often in the form of jokes. And they talk about how there's no point in reporting Islamophobic interactions because that's just how it is for us, and everyone else thinks it's funny, and their belief that no one will do anything anyway, end quote. A 2017 University of Toronto survey of medical residents found that 60% of those who experienced discrimination were Muslim, but most did not report it because they were afraid of being labeled troublemakers. Others may not report due to language barriers or newcomer status. The IMRIT app does what it can to address some of the barriers. Data collection is the key to understanding how Islamophobia works and to advocating for action against it.
In this last segment of the module, we will address ways for educators to stand up against Islamophobia, both in their schools and in their communities. The following resource is from Learning for Justice, which is a great resource made available for educators to equip them with the tools to create a supportive culture to counter Islamophobia in their schools. The following recommendations provide examples of how educators can be intentional about building inclusive and supportive classroom cultures, building the competency to be able to facilitate difficult conversations in the classroom, building the capacity to address anti Muslim hate and bias when they arise in the classrooms or school community, and finally, working with school administrators to create a response plan in case anti Muslim hate incidents arise. Parents and caregivers can play an important role in supporting and advocating for a school culture that affirms the identity of all Muslim students. But also, Muslim students should not have to constantly feel that they need to advocate for themselves. Educators have the duty to learn about diverse Muslim identities, break misconceptions, and unpack and unlearn common stereotypes about Muslims, as well as ensure that the curriculum and learning environment that is created honors their identities.
Novels, graphic novels, articles, TV5 Monde, and Un Jour en Actu all include material from the Francophone Muslim perspective. Finding the right one for your students will require some research and a conversation with colleagues, but the richness and exposure that you can include in your teaching is pertinent to Ontario's current state, as it always will be. Depending on the level and track of your students, consider such works as Kif Kif Demain by Faiza Gen for upper-level students. It is written by a Beret, a French-speaking Arab from the Maghreb that is a first-generation French citizen. Beur and Beret culture, coming from the Verlan for Arabe, is making serious social waves in contemporary France, but is not without conflict, including Islamophobia and sexism. Similarly, La Route de Schlifa by Michel Morineau, a Québécois author, explores the conflict in Lebanon in the 90s and goes deep into tension between Christian and Muslim parties, and then again in Quebec. For upper year students, La Route de Schlifa gives educators a springboard to discuss the humanity and compassion we need in times of conflict. For younger students, Dunya by Maria Zarif is now a series available online as well as in print form. Dunya is a young Syrian girl who flees her country with her grandparents and eventually lands in Quebec. Aimed at a younger audience, it gives a beautiful rendition of hope and perseverance through the eyes of a child. There are many more resources available, of course. A good starting point is to check out the website of Madame Day, a French educator from British Columbia. Her website includes ideas for both core and immersion French, and her articles on equity, anti-racism in the Francophone world, and representation are well chosen. She should suggest a number of French picture books with Muslim characters. Check it out.
These are all strategies to ensure that the learning spaces and the curriculum are reflective of who the students are. In FSL, there are numerous examples of resources that can be used to include in our teaching that give strength and uphold the ministry-required elements of intercultural understanding. Many Muslim authors have written excellent works that give first-hand accounts of the experience of Muslim peoples in the Francophone world. To be able to address Islamophobia in our classrooms and communities, we must first engage in self-reflection to examine our own assumptions and biases about Muslim people. One must wonder, what are some of the common stereotypes I have encountered about Muslims and Islam growing up? Where have I learned about Muslims? One must also examine their own identities and intersectionalities to see how these impact their relationship with Muslims around them. This also requires careful examination of the implicit and explicit messages conveyed to students about Islam. How do you, as an educator, intervene if you encounter microaggressions or anti-Muslim hate rhetoric in your classrooms? To be able to develop strategies to counter Islamophobia, educators must recognize that this comes with challenges. One must first reflect on the barriers that might be experienced at a personal level that might hinder or prevent the implementation of strategies to address Islamophobia. To reflect, you can ask yourself the following questions. Do you think talking about Islamophobia is challenging? If so, why? Do you feel that talking about Islamophobia is necessary and beneficial? If so, why? Think about the impact that you have as an FSL educator to combat Islamophobia and how that can have a huge positive impact on Muslim youth in your classrooms. Without careful self-reflection and examination of one's biases and assumptions, educators can risk creating uncomfortable or discriminatory situations for students. This could include putting students on the spot to share their feelings about world events, condemn violence, or defend their faith. It may include using popular catchphrases and rhetoric to discuss complex world events, which can distort the truth and cause harm to one community or another. It may also include scheduling important exams on religious holidays, especially those that involve fasting. You can explore learningforjustice.org for more accessible resources and more self reflection questions. This slide addresses some strategies that can be used to prepare educators and young people to address hate, prejudice, and stereotypes at school or in other places as well. As an FSL educator and an anti-racist person, what will you do if you encounter incidences of Islamophobia in your classrooms, schools, or in your communities? The most important goal is to confront the prejudiced comment and then support the targeted individual. The 4 speak up strategies are interrupt, question, educate, and echo. Using at least one of these strategies whenever you encounter hate or bias can confront the prejudiced comment and support the targeted person. These strategies have no specific order, though you may find yourself using multiple strategies together.
What can we do in our French language classes to further the conversation? Since we must teach intercultural awareness, including the diversity of the French-speaking world, as FSL educators, we can have a serious impact and an authentic space to begin the conversations about school culture and how to begin the work in anti-oppressive teaching and learning.
Peel District School Board is currently the only public board in Ontario that has developed formal documentation and pillars of implementation to affirm Muslim student identities and strategies to dismantle Islamophobia at a personal and a professional level, an institutional level, and at the Peel District School Board level. This document has been linked for your reference. I would like to focus attention on the 6 pillars of implementation that have been clearly outlined and described in the document. Firstly, building capacity to implement the strategy, which requires collaborative efforts and professional efforts to develop training on what Islamophobia is and how it impacts Muslim students, families, and communities. This also requires understanding the complexity of Islamophobia, including intersectionality. For example, the unique experiences of Muslim women, Black Muslims, or Indigenous Muslims, which requires strategic implementation of support systems that meet their needs. Second, affirming and celebrating Muslim identities, including using resources that acknowledge Muslim contributions across subjects like math, science, history, and the arts to counter the erasure of Muslim identity in the historically Eurocentric curriculum. This is not solely to be celebrated during Ramadan, Eid, or Islamic Heritage Month, but rather ongoing intentional efforts to ensure that the identities of Muslims are reflected in the curriculum by honoring Muslim voices and experiences. Third, creating learning and working environments to intentionally disrupt Islamophobia, including annual mandatory anti-Islamophobia training for staff, establishing prayer spaces or contemplation spaces for staff or student use. Fourth, fostering meaningful engagement with Muslim communities, including partnerships with community agencies and ensuring culturally appropriate referrals to services. Fifth, supporting the mental health and well-being of Muslim students and staff, such as by recognizing Muslim beliefs and practices which are different between individuals and groups, and creating safe spaces for groups such as Muslim Students Associations. And lastly, implementing responsive hiring and supportive measures, including supporting the advancement of racialized employees into leadership roles. Representation within staff and administration matters. Teachers and school leaders from diverse backgrounds offer a unique perspective based on their positionality, which would not be available for a prototypical teacher. Typically, that's white, middle class, Christian, female, born in Canada, and of whom English is the first language. Unfortunately, in Canada, the statistics are shocking, with a clear lack of representation amongst educators from diverse backgrounds. Only 9% of elementary school teachers and 10% of secondary school teachers identify as racialized. For the last part of the presentation, I'm going to leave you with some accounts of student experiences with Islamophobia and microaggressions. These are experiences of high school students in Ontario context. So one of the students mentioned, another thing that I've always found to feel separating was the holiday season. When I was in elementary school and early middle school, we used to do so many activities for Christmas. We even learned about Chinese New Year in chapels and had Diwali activities, and we made little candle holders. But we never used to learn about Eid and Ramadan. Since then, we have started to learn more about them because of the MSA, Muslim Student Association, and that's one of the reasons I'm grateful for this community. However, I still don't know if they now properly teach the younger students in school about those holy celebrations. I really hope they do because, once again, it wasn't the big things that mattered to me. Here's another reflection of a student experiences in a high school context. This is a grade 11 student in an Ontario high school. Something that still follows me to this day is the gym uniforms for sports teams. As a Muslim female, I cannot wear shorts publicly at school because that goes against my morals and modesty. I always found the gym uniform to be a little annoying. Honestly, that's the main reason I stopped going for sports teams. I knew that it was the uniform, and even if I didn't have to wear it to practice every day, I still have to wear it at games and meets. As my school is constantly coming up with new innovative uniform ideas, I hope in the future another female Muslim student has more options than I do currently so that she can feel a little more able to participate. And I'm going to leave you with this last part. Looking like you belong is just as important as feeling that same way.
These systemic efforts to stand up to Islamophobia manifest themselves daily in schools and classrooms. The Learning for Justice Toolkit and the PDSB pillars help us arrive at an inventory of concrete key supports. Consider, is there an accessible and appropriate place for Muslim students to pray at your school? Does your school have a Muslim Students Association to foster affinity, belonging, and leadership? At your school, is Islamic Heritage Month acknowledged and celebrated to honor Muslim identities and create inclusion? What accommodation practices does your school offer for Ramadan and other religious observances like Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha? Is anti-Islamophobia education offered to students so they recognize it? Are your students aware of the process to report Islamophobia? Are staff at your school trained to support students experiencing and reporting Islamophobia? How many Muslim staff members work at your school? Are student identities reflected among staff? Does your school have relationships with Muslim community, agencies, speakers, or artists? Consider where your school might have work to do and celebrate the supports you already offer. Each effort takes thoughtful, collaborative planning for implementation. This is standing up to Islamophobia in schools. We hope that this module has helped you grow understanding of Muslim identities and of Islamophobia. As you move forward with your work against Islamophobia as anti-racist educators within FSL teaching contexts, please consider the small but actionable steps from Series 1, Module 3, as well as the strategies and ideas shared in this module.
Your support and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey. Should you have any questions or comments about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a non-profit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. These modules were designed to support FSL teachers to becoming anti-racist FSL educators through the development of the foundations presented in this series so they may feel more comfortable, confident, and equipped to be equitable and inclusive in their second language learning classrooms in a manner that is sincere and authentic. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module series. In addition, a special thanks goes to the educators who contributed their expertise and their experience to the creation and development of these modules.